he was right about a lot of things. The product stunk, and he wanted to do different things.
Prime time backstory.
Again, I am thrilled to talk with my longtime close personal friend. And I know Gene Okerlund used to say that, but in this case, it's true because Chris Chambers and I have been friends for decades. And he came to work for the WWE back in the early 90s, worked his way up to becoming the senior VP of production strategy and originals. But when we were last talking, we were back in the early 90s when the company was definitely struggling. The WCW was surging, taking a lot of talent away. Chris, really just overall, how much eye rolling was going on when you were talking about some of the storylines that were going on and some of the superstars that were part of the company? Where was the company then?
I would say lost. That's the only way I could put it, because when you say storylines, there were no storylines that were taking place in the ring or on screen. They were promos. People would be cutting promos, and somehow that was the storyline. As we discussed a little bit last week, the shows, Superstars and Challenge in particular, they were all extra or jobber matches, as we used to call it, enhancement matches, to make the so-called superstars seem like they were, invincible stars, and then eventually they would hook up against other superstars. But what was happening is we were kind of caught in that end of the 80s era where people really loved the characters. They loved, Ultimate Warrior, the $1 Million Man, right. All the over-the-top characters, and they really worked. But times had changed, and then it had become quite hackneyed, where there were we had so many dumb characters, I can't even remember them. But when we started moving forward, the whole idea was to make the crowd as interactive as possible, as much as part of the show as possible. And I'd have to say that, that taking a guy like, Shawn Waltman, who was just basically, enhancement, and making it work, and he made it work, and Razor, of course, really made it work. Right. And that was the beginning of something, and I don't think we recognized it at the time, but if you think about it going forward into the Attitude Era, we did that a lot, where
now you mentioned this interaction with the crowd, mm-hmm. and which became a big part of what you guys did moving forward. But it was also a period of real frustration. And were you looking around at what other organizations were doing, what other outfits were doing? Like, for example, ECW, that was their whole gimmick. Mm-hmm. Where the crowd would actually come with items to be able to give to the wrestlers, so they go over and whack the guy with it. I'm not saying to that extreme, but were you paying attention to stuff like seeing that how these guys were getting over because they had that interaction with the crowd?
Yes and no, and it depends on who you talk to. So it's hard to say, because there was a time, honestly, where Vince felt like he could tell the audience when to cheer and when to boo, and he could tell the audience who they would like and who they didn't like. And of course, the creative, they would butt heads, and sometimes it was Bruce Pritchard in charge, and then later Vince Russo, and sometimes people worked together and sometimes they didn't. And I do remember going to again a trip to Vince's house, Vince McMahon, with Vince Russo, and it was one of those uncomfortable creative things, and Vince was on a phone call, and Vince Russo showed me a tape. He goes, "Chris, you gotta see this stuff." And I'm like, "Okay, what is it?" And it was ECW. And honestly, at the time, I didn't know that we were doing any work with them. I had met Paul Heyman a little bit because we were doing a show called Shotgun Saturday Night, which most people forgot about. That was a short-lived show, but it was fun for us. But anyways, he started showing me some stuff, like when they throw the chairs in the ring, which, don't necessarily want to do that. But one of the first ones he showed me was was a guy who at one time was an enhancement talent called Al Snow. And he was doing this thing called head. He had this gimmick head. And he showed me this tape where everyone had brought these styrofoam mannequin heads, and they just
for wigs.
They just chucked them into the into the ring, and the whole ring was filling up with mannequin heads. And when he would come out, people would shake him and stuff. And I was like, "Oh my God, that's fantastic!" And Vince Russo at the time was like, "Yeah, Vince doesn't really get it. He doesn't really want to say." I'm like, "This is great. We can sell mannequin heads, Right. And so eventually we did get Al Snow in there. I don't even remember what year. I actually did the original vignettes with him at WWF, not at ECW. But that was a challenge too, because Vince had a different vision for Al Snow and head, as opposed to what it was, a psychological thing. Vince wanted it to be a physical thing where the head had eyes and moved, and we're like, no, that's not the point. That's not the point. The audience is in on the joke. The audience knows that Al's crazy, but Vince wanted to have a real head.
Well, it always had to have his mark on it, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. We still were in that phase where he was resistant to that kind of change, that other people had a different vision. There was a way to make something work that wasn't your way. There's other ways to make things work. And, and even when you go back, to some of the old vignettes and stuff, it was, I kind of got my foot in a little bit, because in the early days, Bruce Pritchard in particular, he'd do all the vignettes. He'd shoot the vignettes. And sometimes, especially in 93, 94, there, he'd come back and he would be like, I don't even know what to do with this. Here, you see if you can figure it out.
Yeah.
And so we'd take an old smoking guns thing and we'd put bullet holes in it, and all of a sudden it looked like something. Or he shot some vignettes with Mr. Perfect. If you remember Kurt Hennig, one of the greatest people ever. I mean, guy was so funny and so entertaining. But we did these vignettes. One was hockey, and he was skating with, he was playing goalie with Mike Madonna, but Perfect couldn't even skate. He never knew how to skate. So he's in his sneakers.
That from Minnesota.
Yeah. So here's a guy who ends up like a Hall of Fame hockey player, and he's participant, because these are all guys who grew up watching, Bobby the Brain and Hulk Hogan and all that. So they were very willing participants, and they were good sports. Yeah. But the vignettes were terrible. They were shot poorly, and we had to edit them and figure them out. There was another one where Perfect throws a pass to himself, and it does the old, he throws it and then he waits, and looks, and then he runs. You get the ball guns from there, and he catches it. And this guy for the Vikings, Steve Jordan, he was a tight end, a real good tight end at that time. He's watching and putting it over, and the whole thing. But we were in that process. What I'm trying to say is that even Bruce was like, I don't even know what to do with this. Can you make something more of it? And slowly there was a little bit of collaboration beginning, but it was really slow. I mean, really slow. Like we were still doing really dumb gimmicks and, and reveals, and just nothing felt authentic.
What's interesting about that, though, is that at the time, and, we're in the mid 90s here at this point, the WWE,
that'd be early. I was more early, mid to early, like 94, 95, in there, maybe.
Right. But before that, I mean, it was still, as far as the company had come, and as far as the new, standards they'd set in the industry, it was still kind of that old school on how you did things. Like you mentioned, the way Vince always had this mentality, and I remember it very well, that he was basically, we're going to tell the audience how to react. Mm-hmm. That was the mentality of it, because it was that psychology of wrestling, instead of saying, hey, let's listen to what the audience
listen to the audience.
So that's like some of the best wrestlers in the history of professional wrestling. They're the ones that were the most gifted at doing things like that. And there were several that were that way.
Yeah,
But
and they were
it's
and they were
interesting.
really skilled at figuring that they would do that, especially in the house shows or the live
Right.
events, as we used to call them, that were not televised. They would try different things and go, "Oh, that they're reacting to that, or that's
Right.
working." But for the television shows, there was this philosophy of save it for the pay-per-views, save it for whatever. So it was really hard to grow an audience because the audience was just bored. The shows were boring.
Oh,
And as you know better than anybody, they were so promotional. Everything was about selling tickets I mean, half the show was, you, Mean Gene, or, a gorilla or Lord Alfred selling tickets to some event coming to your hometown,
right.
so it was a whole different business model, and yeah, it was, in a way, I think I got there at the best possible time because it was at its worst, and the way I look at things in life is, sometimes when the worst thing happens, there's opportunity. And in this case, I just don't know how it could be much worse. And then thankfully, we had competition, and the competition far exceeded what we were doing. And so we had no choice, but to reinvent ourselves. Honestly, if it wasn't for WCW and Eric Bischoff and Ted Turner's money, I don't know if we'd ever would have gotten out of that tailspin. We might still be
Well, and
doing
I think
the
everybody
plumber
really,
guy and all
yeah,
that. TL Hopper, I remember that one. He had a
yeah.
plunger. Of course, you got to have the gimmick. You got the plunger coming. He needs a plunger as he's going to the ring, right? That's pretty important.
Well, yeah, and then they finish it up with putting the disgusting plunger on the guy's
Yeah,
face when you put.
yeah,
Yeah, I was like, come on.
it's good stuff.
Who didn't see that coming? But when we left off in the last episode, and we were talking about Shawn Michaels and your ascension as you started getting more and more involved and gaining Vince's trust and Kevin's trust, and but it was tough in a sense because you really didn't have the roster, but you did have some people who I think you knew were really talented individuals who could really help develop and take you guys someplace else. But how difficult was it? And we can focus on Shawn, because I think at that time he was really kind of establishing himself as a singles. He was kind of
Oh
out
no,
of
yeah, no,
the
he was.
rearview mirror, but it didn't seem like they really knew what to do with him. So how did that evolution happen, and what was your involvement?
Well, again, that was a process. So Shawn was always difficult to work with back then, just to be quite honest. Even I
In
had
what
a hard
ways?
time. He didn't want to listen to people. He was uncooperative. He was a real pain in the ass. He became one of the nicest people once he found the Lord, and he came back. And I remember seeing him again at WrestleMania 19, and he was a different human being. And for the rest of his career, he was too. And I just want to say this up front. I think he's a wonderful guy, and I loved working with him later. But back then, it was tough. And in his defense, and this is totally in his defense, he was right about a lot of things. The product stunk, and he wanted to do different things. And we did that thing, we talked about with he collapsed in the ring and all that. And part of that was Shawn was getting frustrated, and he was looking for ways out and all of that. But then, again, ironically, we kind of fell into a little bit of a reality-based storyline. And it was the Iron Man match between Shawn and Bret Hart. And that was going to be a big deal out in California. I forget which WrestleMania it was. It was in Anaheim, but it was a really big deal. And part of the promotion were these training vignettes. And the training vignettes they were real. It was Shawn going to where he trained with this guy, Super Sock Jose Lothario, down in Texas. And it's really how we learned to wrestle. And it was like our first, hey, this this is real, actually. This is how we learned, and this is really Shawn being Shawn, and this is really Jose Lothario. This guy really did train him. It was a little snippet of that, and it felt really good.
Reality based. Yeah.
It was very reality based. And then, of course, the match, was fantastic between Bret and Shawn. You got two guys who could work. I didn't even know what that word really meant, when I first started. And then Shawn was the first one who opened my eyes when I saw him work against Vader at SummerSlam in Cleveland one year. And I knew at that point Vader was slow and injured and couldn't move. And Shawn was boom, 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 going all over the place. And I was like, that's what they mean. Shawn's doing all the work. Working, yeah. But when you put Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels together and you're doing a 1 hour Iron Man match, that was, that was great. And then of course the overtime thing and all that happened afterwards. But all of those things were the beginnings of telling more realistic stories, but we weren't there yet. You know what I mean? Yeah. It was still, there was still resistance and all of that.
Well, you mentioned, like Bruce too. And, Bruce came from this background in Texas of, the early days of wrestling and all that, and certainly a creative, but he didn't really have a rich production background. It was kind of interesting that he was head of production when I was there at the studios, and but as you mentioned, that he would go out and they'd shoot this stuff. He was kind of in charge of it. Somebody who didn't really have a rich background of how you put a story together with the camera. And so what was that process like? And when did they start trusting you with some of this stuff on how to tell these stories? I mean, it was a little late. The right idea, but how to make it pop and make it.
Again, it was a little later. Maybe things they didn't really care that much about. Like Al Snow and Head, but then I worked my way into doing I did all the Dude Love and Mick Foley things, and then I did Desire videos. I did something with Triple H with a U2 song, Beautiful Day. I did a lot of those kinds of things, Goldust, back in the day. But I'm going to go backwards for a second. Bruce, he used to do all of the Undertaker vignettes, and of course Undertaker was the epitome of a character. And so Bruce would collaborate with Kerwin Silfies, God rest his soul, just recently passed away. He was our director for TV for many years.
We should take a little time here since you did mention Kerwin.
Yeah, it had to,
Really, I worked with him for a long time, at least when I was there, and he was just incredible. You can imagine then, because we have spoken before that there was this evolution going on within the company, and and Kerwin didn't come from a wrestling background either, and I don't think he ever really got credit, especially from those early days of making those productions look network level.
He did, like those Undertaker vignettes, some of those old ones in the graveyards, and as we were preparing for the Buried Alive matches and things like that. Those were all Kerwin with Bruce, and they did a great job. I mean, some of those things, that was the fun. That was the conundrum. Is like sometimes you'd be working with these characters like Taker, and it works because it's like a movie. You're working it's like a movie character, and then sometimes it's hard to translate that into the ring. Taker did. I mean, he did it brilliantly, and so. There was still that transition, and because you still had guys like Undertaker on the roster, and we were eventually going to be moving into a more reality-based direction, and so that whole transition was particularly challenging. But there were times when like when Vignettes, you were saying, as we got more into the Attitude Era, and I don't remember Bruce. He was there, he was gone, he came back. Him and Vince so I can't remember the specifics of poor Bruce's comings and goings. But there was a time when we were we had no choice. We had to step in and do, some of the vignettes and
yeah, because you talk about them going out and shooting this stuff, and a lot of what you did was them coming back and saying, "Here, do something with this,"
yeah.
Which must have been really difficult because you couldn't. You couldn't.
Yeah, you weren't able to
and then shoot it and then come back with this on your head. You're like, oh, what am I going to do with this?
Exactly, and it was really challenging. But the great part about that was it was a great learning tool. So as an editor, you know this. You learn what you don't have. You're like, God, I could have used a shot of this. I could have used a shot of that. So in the process of doing that, you're learning how to direct, because now when it's your turn to go out in the field, you're editing in your head as you're shooting. And you're like, I need a shot of this, I need a shot of that. And, you know how it's all going to go together. So you're not wasting time when you go out there. So, one of the processes that I tried to introduce or did introduce to the company was producers who actually physically edited, because we learned that at Major League Baseball productions. We all did that ourselves. And, in the process, when you're editing, you also learn how to direct. And, Kerwin, getting back to Kerwin for a second, he would, direct the shows, but then he would come back to TV and he would edit the matches, and he would show us, the mistakes that were made, or why we're making this edit, we're protecting this, or we don't want to see that. And it was a very great learning tool, just to have, we used to call them the ISO matches. The matches would come back clean from TV, and then we'd get the reels and we'd fix, the little mistakes, or, oh, we don't want to see that guy sneaking up, or whatever it happened to be. Now, of course, they had to eventually do all of that live, which is very challenging. But anyways, I digress I'm sorry, if I'm going all over the place, and I apologize for that. But it's strange when you think about how everything really does tie into each other. Whether, the director on the road is helping you back here, the editors are helping the guys doing the vignettes, the guys back here have ideas for vignettes and how to do them, a different way. And then eventually, you get to do some really fun ones, or emergency ones, or whatever, and it's a lot.
Yeah. And Chris, was there a point, because someone like Shawn Michaels was resistant to any outside influence creatively, whether he thought he had it all together or whatever. But was there a point, and maybe it's somebody else, because I don't know at what point you actually started to be able to go out and shoot these things and conceptualize them and have this vision. But was there a point, when did the superstars start trusting you? Was there a moment you remember where one of them, something you did, you put together afterwards, where when they were shooting it, they're going like, oh my God, well, I don't know what you're doing here. And then after you put it together, they're like, dude, that was like, wow. How did you do that? When did that happen? Do you remember an instance?
There's a bunch of them, the most impactful one was when I wrote and conceived of all of the Stone Cold vignettes, the original ones that were shot in a warehouse. But that was down a little bit down the road. But one of the little things, vignette kind of thing that Bruce, did, which I think, believe it or not, it was a silly little thing, but it kind of opened the door for me, were these Jeff Jarrett vignettes. When he first came up, he was JEFFJARRET, and that was the vignette. And he would do this thing, and I had it back in the edit room, and it's just like, it's just missing something. It just, I don't know what it is. It needs like a button on the end of it or something. So I was with Kevin Quinn, the editor. And we were like, there's got to be something. And we're looking at it, and we're looking at that big shitty grin he's got, after he says, and I'm like,
smarmy.
Yeah, what if we put like a little sparkle on his teeth with a sound effect that goes ding? And he goes, and I said, can you do that? And he goes, sure. He goes to the switcher, KQ, he could create anything in a switcher. Yeah. And he makes like the sparkle. He puts it on his teeth, and then in audio, we put in the ding. And so it was JARRET. ding, and it was like boom, like and it works, and Bruce loved it, and they aired, and he got heat off of this, like he got heat because of the ding, and it was so funny because I hadn't met Jeff Jarrett, and I ran into him. Gosh, it was like years later, and he was, "Oh, Christian, I know your name. Why do I know your name?" And I'm like, "Well, I actually probably from those silly vignettes you did back with the, he goes, "Oh my God, I love that. That was like my favorite thing." And so it was a tiny, tiny little addition. I didn't really change the rest of the vignette. We just added that. And so with a tiny little thing like that, it helped. And so what you're learning is, as you go along, now there's all kinds of tiny little things. You're trying to help with and the music, and then I got to work with Jim Johnston on so many entrance things, and I mean all over the place, from Goldust, like Goldust. Okay, when he made his debut, it was funny because they were trying. I still remember this. He was in the studio, and Howard Finkel's reading the Goldust. He's trying to figure out how his name should be, pronounced. And of course it was just Goldust. But Jim and I were talking, and we were like, his gimmick is, Marlena's, she's a director, and he's like this androgynous, weird. It was so far ahead of its time when you think about it. He was, I trans something. I don't know what the proper term would be, but he's in the T community, I guess. But anyways, so we were trying to figure out his entrance and like how to present him, from these vignettes. And Jim and I came up with this whole movie entrance. I made all this crap up. I completely just made up 24 karat productions, gold bars, whatever. I just made stuff up because back in those days, if you remember, you'd go to the movies, and in the beginning of the movie, they would be like 8,000 Mirror Mix pictures in association with Schneebitz, along with Joe Beavens, along with Bubba Presents, So we're like, let's do that. Let's create this silly, outrageous thing. And Jim came up with this, the entrance theme is fantastic. And with those little ring, like the whole thing, the Goldust is the name of the movie. That was like what we were doing. And so when that final big beat hit, it says Goldust, and the crowd, would pop. And it was just, I guess I'm getting off track again, but those were like the early kinds of things that were, trying to, help make an impact. And that was just really, it was an entrance video, really. It turned into a vignette that became his entrance, after the initial ones. But there was a lot of them over the year. And then once we started doing more, once I started doing the Stone Cold stuff, then I did some, with Batista and the Attitude spots, and there were just Kurt Angle, the Three Eyes, did those, and just a bunch of different ones. And someday when we have time, I can get into how those came about. But those,
well, we will absolutely we'll do that. But it's what was Vince's reaction? Because we're down the road now from where Vince is basically kind of trying to let go of the reins a little bit, let you guys do what you do. What was his reaction to this stuff that you were doing? As subtle as some of it was, as you like with Jeff Jarrett or Goldust, or what you were doing with Shawn. What was his reaction to it all? You think it was just really hard for him not to, try and step in and stop it? That's one of the wonderful things about Vince is, like, if it works, he likes it. And it's his idea too. If he loves it, that means that he did it. So, he was great. That's the funny thing. And sometimes what do you got for me this time? What can you do with this? And so it became fun. Now, intimidating working with Vince, because he, as you know more than anybody, is the most opinionated person in the world. And
he almost fired me a couple of times for vignettes, and he did end up firing me once back in 2007. So it isn't like it was all sunshine and lollipops, but he almost fired me for this. He wanted to fire me for the Stone Cold vignettes. That's a long story. I'll get into that at some point, but and then for another vignettes that I did too, but that I wrote, he didn't approve of, but they ended up working pretty well. So no, I mean, Vince, he really was the kind of person where even if he said, it's whatever, if it worked, he liked it. And he was very encouraging, about that. So, he was good with that. Like, he liked those changes and tweaks, and he kind of understood now that he had a team at the studio that he didn't need to dictate to, that he could count on them to make things better. And that's what we were doing. So then at that point, he was allowing us to do pay-per-view packages. Like in the early days, Shawn, when I first started, this is going to sound crazy to you. Even a simple B-roll, like here's a highlight from last week. We had to send it to Vince's office for approval. Okay. Wow. Within a couple of years, we're doing vignettes, cold opens for pay-per-views, and he wouldn't even see them until he got to the arena. And sometimes he'd have a tweak on something. We'd change it to, do a satellite feed. But for the most part, what he trusted that he had a team that he could count on to deliver. And he knew, and I'll give him credit for this, he knew we could do a better job than he could. We understood how to work with music and editing and deliver a product that would help the company grow, meaning help the characters, help the storylines, enhance the storylines. I remember we got so good at packages and we had so many good guys doing them. I was the first one to start doing them, but then guys came along like Adam Panucci and them who were just, they were masters at it. Yeah. That I remember Michael Hayes saying, "God damn, Vince, I wish the storylines we wrote were as good as these friggin' packages." Because of course we take all the good stuff and put music to it and make it look really good. But once we started working on, pay-per-view packages and opens, a highlight package for Monday Night Raw and things like that, he started trusting us more. And so he knew he had a team in place. So when that time did come, when it was time to hand over a lot of the stuff, when WCW was kicking our ass, once Vince was ready, I think in his mind, he knew he had the talent at the studio. And I think somewhere in his heart, he also understood that he had a good roster of boys, talent, that maybe he should listen to them as well. So getting back again, like when you go back to the Shawn and all those guys, part of it was guys like Shawn and Triple H and, a lot of them, even Steve, they had ideas for what they wanted to do, with their characters and with and they weren't able to. After that, they could, and that was a huge change.
And what was that process too? Because not only did you have to convince Vince, but also the boys. And you had some good talent there, but I don't think they were very trusting of the talent, the people that were shaping storylines there. And did it start getting to the point where they see some of this stuff and they're like, "Hey, wait a minute! I want you to do that for me." Yeah,
it did.
And who was that really the first to step up? Who were some of the first ones who said, "Hey, wait a minute"?
Well, it was a process. So getting back to again for the old school thing. So a lot of the older guys didn't trust us. Okay. Yeah. I earned Bret's trust by doing something for his agent, Barry Bloom. It was like a sizzle reel for Bret to get, stuff in Hollywood and stuff when he did some Lonesome Dove and things like that. But it was a very long process because the boys back then didn't trust anybody, from TV. They looked at The Office, as they would call us, because they just looked at it like we were trying to, get them to do a lot of work, so to sell tickets and all that, and they weren't going to get anything out of it. I think the first guys the first person who really got it was Stone Cold. Once he realized, holy crap, the TV studio really helped me create my whole thing. And then other guys kind of saw that. And then later, by the time we got to guys like The Rock, they knew, because first of all, he was training in the TV studio. The ring was right over there, and he kind of, he got to know some of us and saw what we were doing. So he knew what the power of the TV studio, what we could do for these guys. So that was a transitional thing too. But a lot of it too was these old school guys who now understood. So Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Mick Foley. Mick Foley was a huge advocate of all of us. I loved working with Mick. He really got it. He's so smart, but he got it. He understood that, storytelling, editing, what the packages we could do, everything would help him. And so I loved working with him. But so now you've got a combination of these old school guys who got it, and then you have these younger guys who are, looking up to these guys and seeing them be, treating us differently than it used to be. And it became very much, again, like a team effort. And, we weren't there to dictate to anybody. We were there to help, and throw ideas around, whether it was music ideas, graphic ideas, whatever it happened to be, even a slogan or two, whatever it would happen to be. And, it was great. And, as I mentioned before, when we did switch into that period, when we started, before it got labeled the Attitude Era, we were in it already. That's another story. But the teamwork was really essential, and it was firing on all cylinders. The creative team, the TV studio, and the performers, everyone was working together. It really was like a team. It really was.
Well, initially, you had this roster. We talked about, you had some guys that would eventually become, mega stars, superstars. But you've got, the top of the list here is, you've got Kevin Nash, Diesel, Bret's still there, Bret the Hitman Hart, Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker, Razor Ramon, Scott Hall, Bam Bam Bigelow was also part of that. Psycho Sid was there, Yokozuna. So you had some, big names there, but it was this period where nothing was really going on. And now you're starting to develop these guys. We'll get into later how, the clique would form not too much longer after that. And that would have a major impact on how, and caused a lot of controversy and a lot happening between the back the scenes there. But when you've got these guys here, and they're you obviously know they're very talented. It's like, okay, now what do we do with them? And now they're starting to pay attention while you're still, as you mentioned, getting your ass kicked. How do you stay the course there? Because it's an easy thing to do, to just start throwing shit against the wall and like, okay, is that going to work? And it seemed like you guys did have a focus with these guys.
When you say these guys, like Nash and Ray, they ended up leaving. Yeah,
the big names that you had there, like, and Bret, and
Well, they all ended up leaving eventually and going to WCW, and that's what really took it for us to turn the whole thing around. We had little snippets of things that were working and things that were kind of working, like the Hollywood Backlot Brawl with Razor and Goldust. It was weird. It was different. It was kind of breaking boundaries, and some of it was pre-taped. Some of it was. So there were things that this kind of works, but we were still stuck in the gimmick character things. And in some cases it's hard, because then like a Goldust character kind of is working, and that is like an old school Undertaker, over the top. character. So you kind of scratch your head. Wait a minute, but that's working. So we were still in that mixed up phase. It was really, when Razor and Diesel left, Scott and Kevin Nash, the impact was felt immediately, when they showed up as themselves, but ostensibly they blurred the lines, saying that the storyline was basically they hadn't left the WWF. They were invaders. That was their thing. And it was very clever. It was super well done and very confusing. And it had everybody on their heels here. Cause we were like, what do you do? They tried to sue them. It was like, it was crazy. It was, so I'm going, sorry, I'm digressing a bit, but the point was, we didn't even know what we were doing with those guys, because Scott Hall was still Razor, but Razor was a gimmick from, it's not cool anymore. It just kind of wasn't working. And Diesel it's a gimmick, and it was kind of over, but not over. You know what I mean?
A lot of layers.
It just wasn't Big Daddy cool. It was kind of okay, but it wasn't really there. We even had Pam Anderson and Jenny McCarthy, at the WrestleMania, whatever that was, 10 or 11, whatever, in Hartford, wherever that was. But it was like kind of like, some things were okay, but nothing was Hulk Hogan. Nothing was eventually Stone Cold or The Rock. We were stuck in this weird thing. And poor Bret Hart, he was the guy for us. And we were putting everything on his shoulders. And eventually what happened was we couldn't afford to pay him anymore. That's how bad business was. And,
Yeah, but was there a feeling, Chris, that, and nothing to take away from Bret, he's one of my favorite superstars of all time, but that he just couldn't bring the company to the heights that Hulk did. And I don't know if anybody ever could, but, was there kind of that feeling like it's just not going to, he just can't get there? Because Vince went back on that deal with him, and he really kind of left him no choice.
Oh, no, Vince helped him actually negotiate that deal to get out, believe it or not. He really did. I mean, what it was Vince had given Bret a really sweet deal, and but he couldn't afford to pay him anymore. And so he didn't want to ruin Bret's negotiating strength. So Vince kind of like, he enabled Bret to make a good deal, with Bischoff and WCW. And really at that time, it wasn't any kind of, it wasn't meant to be a diss to Bret in any way. It was really, the product wasn't very good, and we didn't have the money to pay him. And, we weren't selling tickets, and pay-per-views were down, and, we were trying everything. We were doing those small pay-per-views, the in your houses and things like that. And, it was a really difficult time because, I think I can understand why Bret's feelings would have been hurt and everything. But at the same time, from a business standpoint, it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to work. And,
was the purge necessary with the way it worked out? That everybody talks about. Remember the curtain call that was still to this day is talked about, but where the company really was like pillaged. I mean, it was there was, I don't know, maybe was that the bottom of this is it, because all that talent was gone.
It was the bottom, and that's what ironically began. Again, like when you reach bottom, there's no place else to go but up. And the curtain call, and from being at the company years, it it broke the golden rule.
Mortal sin.
It broke kayfabe. You had bad guys and good guys, in the ring at the time, and of course, Razor and Diesel didn't care. They were, they were off on their way, and Shawn was kind of like in FU mode, and so poor Triple H, he was the one
that took the brunt. Yeah,
and he did. He had to eat crap for a long time, and he did, and he didn't complain about it or anything. He just took it. And he had a dumb gimmick too, the blue blood from Greenwich, Connecticut. Where that idea came from, so yeah, it's ironic in a way because it happened, and in retrospect now, it was the best thing that could have possibly happened. At the time, it was like, we're dead. This is the end of us. We've lost all of our talent. And then when they started Nitro and introduced those guys as, the outsiders, and then of course later everything that happened, it was like, oof, but in retrospect, yes, it had to happen. And it was the best thing because the other thing it did was all that other talent that was left still on the roster, it was time to step up. Rock was there as Rocky Maivia, the Ringmaster, Steve Austin, Triple H, Hunter Hearst Helmsley became Triple H. All of those guys morphed into something else. Even characters that were there evolved, whether it was Taker, whether it was Mankind, whoever it was. And they all had opportunities now. And now it was on them and on us to help them to compete and to get there. And, it worked. It was great, yeah. So,
amazing.
But the curtain call is still, like at the time, man, Vince was pissed, man.
Oh, God, I can't imagine. Yeah.
That was, that was the golden rule. And man, it wasn't just, that's not hyperbole like people, oh yeah, get her there. It was ugly for a while.
Yeah. Well, and also for a number of reasons, but also the fact that Vince didn't know it was coming. And he didn't know what they were up to.
No.
And that was, you talk about, damning a commandment. I mean, my God. And really, I think that's kind of where it changed forever. And the company, as you said, had pretty much reached rock bottom, and all this talent was gone. You still had some talented individuals. We're gonna stop you here because when we pick it up again, I want to talk about how the clique that these guys that we're a part of, we were talking Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Triple H, and Sean Waltman, in a sense, took over that roster and had a lot of influence on what was happening. And leading up to that curtain call and eventually the departure of those guys, as you said, ended up being one of the best things to ever happen to the company. It's something that needed to happen.
It definitely needed to happen. And, again, like sometimes you don't realize that sometimes the worst things that happen to you turn out to be the best if you have patience and you stick with it and you move forward. And that it didn't feel like it at the time. I'll tell you that it was pretty. It was pretty.
Then we'd see people like, if that wouldn't have happened and those guys would not have been made an exit. Who knows? Never have heard of The Rock or Stone Cold.
Exactly. It created great opportunities for other guys and girls, and just the general direction of the industry in general. It completely shifted, and it shifted into more reality based, and that, as it turned out, was exactly what it needed. So.
Yeah. Well, folks, talking about a lot of dark times in the WWE, but we needed to get through all that to really.
I hope this wasn't too much of a buzzkill.
Well, I know, but I mean, we needed to know where this company was and how it changed for absolutely the better. And we're all thankful for having characters like The Rock and Stone Cold, and that would come out of it and launch the country, the company into a new millennium, and changing that industry forever for the better. So yeah, awesome. Chris, thanks for joining us this time out, and I can't wait till we pick it up because I wasn't there when the click was in full form, and I know you got a lot of stories and beyond, and what happened once that exit happened, and we got to see some of the greatest superstars ever emerge in the company.
Prime